Three, two, one, here we go. Welcome to Inside Israel, everyone. I'm Joel Chasnoff. It is the week of April 9th, 2025. And today I'm going to give you a roundup of the biggest stories coming out of Israel right now, and more importantly, what Israelis are saying about them. Before we jump in, I just want to give you a few quick reminders. First of all, these Sunday broadcasts that are live are not the same as the ones that drop on Wednesday on Apple and on Spotify. So if you're enjoying it, I really encourage you to subscribe to Apple and to Spotify because you can get different content there. It drops on Wednesdays right onto your phone if that's where you listen to your podcast. Number two, I did create a PDF for Passover, a Passover supplement. Those of you on the mailing list already had a chance to download it, but if you haven't yet, check out joelchasnoff.com. Right on the homepage, there's a little strip toward the top where you can download this year's Passover PDF. And the idea there is to help you create conversation at your Seder about Israel. And this one has some really tough issues raised in it about what it means to support Israel if you're a Jewish communal leader, like a professional Jew, and also the idea of reaching a fifth child. We speak of four children on Passover, but maybe there's a fifth, the one who's not connected to Israel. How do we connect with this child who doesn't even have Israel on his or her particular radar? So check out that PDF. It's at joelchasnoff.com. Also, I've been producing some comedic shorts, some short videos about Israel and Passover and life in Israel during Passover. Those are on Instagram. I don't know if you're with me on Instagram, but if you're not, you might as well be. It's a fun place to see comedy of mine. The handle is simple, at Joel Chasnoff on Instagram. Okay. So what I want to do today is assess where we stand as we move into Passover. It's hard to believe, but we are now a year and a half away from October 7th, 2023. April 7th, tomorrow, marks the 1.5 year anniversary of October 7th. And I think the main thing Israelis are thinking about right now on a global level is just the impossibility, the unbelievability of the situation we're in right now. I distinctly remember last Passover putting an empty chair at my Seder table for Naama Levi. Naama is from Ra'anana. My family, my kids knew her in various walks of life, youth group and tennis. And so, of all the hostages, she was probably one of those who hit home the most for us just because she's a neighbor and a semi friend. And I remember putting a chair at our table for her. Now, thank God she has since come home. But if you had asked me last Passover, would we still be putting empty chairs at our Passover table a year from now? I don't think I would have said yes. I couldn't have told you how the hostages would come home or how the war would have ended, but I would have assumed that over the year between last Passover and this one, somehow it would have been resolved. The idea that we still have 59 hostages there is something that I'm struggling with, and I mean every Israeli is struggling with. As we go out to buy our matzah, as we make up our guest lists and arrange our desserts and make plans for the Seder, it's on our minds that this just doesn't feel right. And I think what's really different this year is last year at Passover, we were still living in that sort of riddle of what exactly is happening, what's going on, um, how is this going to resolve itself. And now most of us, feel that we've had opportunities to bring all the hostages home. Our government simply has made the choice not to. I mean, the polling supports this. As I've said before on this podcast, 70% of Israelis favor ending the war completely if it means bringing the hostages home. And you can ask, well, what does that mean for Hamas? Well, what if they rearm? What if they get more money and weapons from Iran and plan to attack again? Well, I think the feeling is that they will. And in a way, that might be good for us. If we end the war and get the hostages out, All we need is Hamas to launch one measly missile at the south, and we can go in with full force, and we don't have to do it with ground troops anymore. We can go in from the air and not have to worry about killing our own hostages. So that's one of the big obstacles to us winning the war, is the fact that we still have to take into account the hostages who are there and who we don't want to harm. So the idea that a year ago we'd still have hostages there, it's really unfathomable to me and to most Israelis. And I think that's the number one thing on our minds right now. Here's some other little stories that are playing out in Israel and what Israelis are saying about them. So first of all, we have Netanyahu being in Hungary this past weekend, which on its surface there's nothing wrong with that. But what really stuck many of us as a thorn in our sides is the fact that Netanyahu and his wife Sarah extended their trip there, little vacation. They stayed 2 extra days, and now they're flying to Washington. They could have flown to Washington 2 days ago, but they decided to take 2 extra days in Hungary, and there were photos taken of them shopping and buying very expensive handbags, and they blurred out the name brand on these, handbags so that the Israeli public wouldn't, see how much they were spending. But talk about bad taste. Just the idea that our prime minister and his wife would take a vacation in Europe and go shopping at expensive stores while we have hostages in Gaza and troops now fighting again in the Gaza Strip. And it really goes to the whole idea, which is the second sort of story floating around right now, is of just how tone deaf Netanyahu seems to be. It's not just that he's ignoring the public will to have a state inquiry into October 7th. It's the idea that his language and his behavior is truly out of step with where we are psychologically. Just last week, he was talking about Qatargate, this story where two of his aides had they've been found to be negotiating with Qatar. Qatar, which is the home of Hamas. Two Netanyahu aides were receiving money from Qatar in order to plant positive news stories about Qatar in Israeli media. um, Most Israelis believe that Netanyahu was aware of this and was part of it. And while they were being questioned, Netanyahu said that his two aides were kidnapped and being held hostage by the police. And just the idea of using those terms, kidnapped and held hostage, when we have literally 59 hostages in Gaza, is just completely tone deaf. And again, completely out of step with where the Israeli public is. Another big story that's emerging right now in Israel is that the head of the Shin Bet, Ronen Bar, who has been fired by Netanyahu, but his position, he hasn't left the position yet because it needs to be approved by the attorney general, sort of a long story. But Ronen Bar wrote a letter to the attorney general this week in which he said that Netanyahu had been pressuring him many, many times to say that it was unsafe for Netanyahu to be a witness on trial and to be brought to court to testify, and basically asking that his trial be canceled on the grounds of safety. And what you can see here is really a Netanyahu who is desperate to have his trial end any way possible, whether it's pressuring the head of the Shin Bet to announce that it's unsafe for him to stand trial. I don't know why it would be unsafe, but he wanted the Shin Bet to announce that it was unsafe. Once you hear that he's willing to do that, it makes you realize that Netanyahu is willing to do just about anything to avoid standing trial. Anything including going back to war in Gaza, including letting the hostages stay in Gaza because he knows that once the hostages come home, he'll probably collapse. So that's another thing that Israelis are talking about, is just how far this man will go in order to save himself, really sacrificing literally the lives of those who are civilians in his country and soldiers in his country, sacrificing them for the sake of his own well-being. So that's another thing that we're talking about as we move into Passover and the holiday of freedom. There's some talk about the Gaza ambulance strike. This story, I'm sure you've heard in the US, is where the IDF bombed a few ambulances in Gaza. Originally, they said that the lights on these ambulances were off, and then the New York Times revealed that the lights were in fact on. Look, this is obviously a this reflects poorly on the IDF, the fact that they bombed ambulances whose lights were on. But I will say two things. Number one, Israelis are not wringing our hands nearly as much as you would expect or nearly as much as you would see in the rest of the world, simply because we have our soldiers in Gaza under threat and we have hostages being held in Gaza that we just don't have the mental space to be worried about innocent civilians being killed in Gaza the way the rest of the world is. But beyond that, it's been well known and documented that Hamas uses ambulances as a way to transport military equipment and Hamas operatives. And so I don't necessarily fault the IDF for doing this. It could be that we had bad intelligence, but what we found is that so far it does seem like of the 15 medics who were killed, 6 were actually working for Hamas. So, if 6/15, what is that? Uh, 30% or whatever of the uh, 40% of those killed were actually Hamas operatives. In a way, you could say that this was an operation that had to happen, and the rules of war would support that. So it doesn't reflect well on Israel, but we're not crying over this because we know that Hamas uses hospitals, uses ambulances as bases of operation, as means of transporting equipment and troops. And so this is most likely what happened here as well, at least what the IDF had suspected. Another story that we're kind of hearing in Israel is that there's a possibility of an imminent attack on Iran. The Israeli government is putting forth more and more evidence. There was just evidence released today that Hamas asked uh, Iran for $500 million in 2021 with the goal of destroying Israel in 2 years. That was found. We have paperwork stating so much in Gaza. And it really shows that, and Iran agreed, by the way, Iran agreed to fund Hamas for the purpose of destroying Israel within 2 years. And it really, uh, I think the government is doing this to demonstrate to the public just how clear it is that it's Iran who is as they often say, the head of the serpent here, who's really in charge. And I think there are those in Israel who are saying that what this is the government preparing us for some sort of imminent attack on Iran. Now, I don't know how imminent is, if it's next week or next month or by the end of 2028. Imminent can mean many things in the Middle East. But it's becoming more and more clear that it's not so much the Houthis, it's not so much Hamas, it's Iran who's behind all of it. And that to really take out our threats would mean taking out them. So that's another thing that Israelis are talking about right now. Just the possibility that we might have an altercation with Iran in the near future. In terms of the tariffs and Trump's tariffs on Israelis, that is really not something that the average Israeli is talking about right now. At least it hasn't come up much in my conversations with Israelis, and I'm here in Israel right now. I think one reason is that it's not. We have so many other stories in our news cycle that are more prominent that it's just not front and center for us. But another reason is that it's already so expensive to live here, like mind-blowingly expensive, that the idea of prices going up even more, although it doesn't feel good to hear, it's not necessarily shocking. It's not anything necessarily new. Just to give you a little bit of perspective, I know there's a lot of talk in the US about eggs being $8 for 12 or $9 for a dozen, something like that. Let's talk about gas here in Israel. Do you have any idea how much it costs to fill up a tank of gas? In Israel, we pay over $7 a gallon for gas, and that's on a good day. That's when there's no war with Hamas, no war with Hezbollah, no tariffs, no terrorism, just an ordinary Wednesday in April. On any given normal year, we're paying $7 plus for a gallon of gas. We already live in this world of highly inflated prices where there's basically a monopoly on all the importers of cars and food and other products, so they can charge as much as they want. There's excessive taxes here. The taxes on a new car are 100%. So whatever the car is in the US, you're going to pay double that for the same car in Israel. And so the idea of tariffs, we're not really feeling it, and we also I don't think we can envision what would be even more expensive than the lifestyle we're living right now. One thing I've tried many times to convey to Jews in particular outside of Israel who support Israel and love Israel is just how hard it is to live here, and specifically economically, just how tough it is to get through the month. Most Israelis live in debt. They live in the red with a negative balance in their in their bank accounts. The banking system here allows you to do that. And so they take advantage of it as a way to go on vacation, pay for their kids' activities and school fees. Living in debt is a part of Israeli life. And it's really very hard to get by if you're not doing so. So I want to communicate to audiences just how hard it is economically to live here. But that's what Israelis are talking about right now. And I think what all these stories sort of tie together in is a country that feels very much on the precipice of something, but we're not sure what. We don't know where the war is going. We don't know how these hostages are going to get home. If you are asking me today, do you think next Passover 2026 the hostages will be home by then? I can't say with confidence that I do, because the next elections aren't until the fall of 2026. And so there's really no reason to believe that they would be home before then. And even if they are home, how many of them would be able to survive another year? Just the fact that they've been able to survive this long, if they have, is incredible. So I can't say with the same assurance that I felt a year ago that I know for certain that the hostages will be home a year from now. I wish I could. But just to give you some of the statistics that back all this up in terms of what Israelis are thinking. So right now we have 60% of Israelis saying that they absolutely do not believe Netanyahu. They think he's lying when he says that he doesn't know anything about the money being paid by Qatar to members of his own staff for planting positive news stories about Qatar in the Israeli media. He says, I know nothing about it, but 60% of Israelis think he's lying right there. We've lost trust in him. 70% of Israelis don't want Netanyahu to be prime minister. 70% want a state inquiry into October 7th. This would seem the most natural thing in any country, that after a tragedy like October 7th, you would have a state inquiry into how we could prevent future such events. But Netanyahu refuses to put forward a state inquiry, of course, because he's afraid of what they would find. And 70% of the people in Israel want the war to end so that we can bring the hostages home. And someone I see wrote here in the chat, what about the large protests that are happening in Israel? Well, first of all, they're not nearly as large as they used to be. They're still large, but I think the government is counting on something, and they're they're kind of right. They're counting on our exhaustion. This is a war of attrition between the government and us, and I think they're just assuming that eventually we are going to run out of steam, and we are. To be able to protest week after week for 18 months, to be able to keep the hostages front of mind day after day for a year and a half, it's hard and it's exhausting. And I think the government is just being worn down. So the answer is no. These protests are not having an impact on the government at all. They don't seem to be. I'm not saying they're ineffective. We need to do them, and the reason is to show the hostages. You know, it's been found that hostages in Gaza are aware of protests on their behalf, and we want to support the families of hostages here. But in terms of it making an impact on the politicians and changing politics, absolutely not. And I don't see that changing at all. Here's the strangest number of all, though. When they present the poll question, who is best fit to be prime minister, there's only one person who polls ahead of Netanyahu. If you poll Netanyahu against Yair Lapid, who is the head of the opposition, Netanyahu, people say, is more fit to be prime minister. They say he's more fit than Benny Gantz, than Yair Golan, head of the New Democrats. The only person who polls ahead of Netanyahu is Naftali Bennett, who has just filed the paperwork to form a new political party here. And he would certainly have my vote and the vote of most Israelis. He is the one who would be able to defeat Netanyahu. But this is sort of unbelievable to me that you have polling numbers that show how unhappy Israelis are with Netanyahu on the one hand, but at the same time, they're saying that he's more fit to be prime minister than Lapid, Yair Golan, than Benny Gantz. And I think what's happening here is that Bibi is seen as prime ministerial. He's seen as a leader. He's seen as strong. Now, we don't like what he's doing, but we see him as the type of guy who can be prime minister. Whereas Yair Lapid, Benny Gantz, Yair Golan, I agree. I don't see them as the prime minister types. They don't seem to have the backbone. They don't seem to have the spine. They don't seem to have the knowledge. Now, I'm not saying I would vote for Netanyahu over them. I would vote for any one of them over Netanyahu. But in terms of what the question is asking, who is more fit to be prime minister, you can kind of see why Israelis would keep saying Netanyahu, despite the fact that most want him to step down. All right, we're going to go on to your questions right now. We have a question from Sam. Sam said, I read on Ynet this wild story that the IDF is organizing trips for American tourists to do hiking inside Syria over Passover vacation. I'm wondering if anyone but Americans would do this type of thing and if Israelis are on board. This seems to me a kind of crazy idea, especially when there are complaints of a lack of soldiers in the IDF. So I had not heard of this story, Sam, but I looked it up, and lo and behold, you are correct. Tour companies in Israel are offering day trips into the Syrian side of the Golan Heights. Right now, Israel has troops stationed on the Syrian side of the Golan Heights. And apparently, tour companies made a deal with a battalion in the IDF that the IDF will send soldiers to accompany these groups and protect them. And I'm with you on this, Sam. It seems to me, especially when we say we don't have enough soldiers, a huge waste of manpower and women power when we don't to send them to guard hikers when we don't have enough soldiers to fight in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Syria, and the West Bank as it is. It also just seems to me in poor taste that while we have hostages in Gaza, soldiers fighting on these multiple fronts, to take a trip to Syria during that time, to me, that just seems excessive, unnecessary, and in poor taste in light of the circumstances. So I'm with you on this one, Sam. Gary asked a question. He said, on your ethics podcast a few weeks ago, Dr. Asa Kasher said that we do not always provide advance notice when attacking a civilian structure that belongs to the enemy. I've never heard this before. Can you verify? I didn't remember this part of the interview, but alas, you are correct. And just to remind everyone, Dr. Asa Kasher is a professor here in Israel who helped write Purity of Arms, which is the IDF's code of ethics. And in general, the IDF does have a policy of notifying, let's say, an apartment building before it gets bombed so that the residents can leave. However, I think what Dr. Kasher is referring to is if we have a very high level target, for example, Nasrallah or someone high up in Hamas who literally killing this person would save hundreds, perhaps thousands of lives here in Israel, then we would not provide advance notice. So I still believe that the IDF is, in general, the most ethical army in the world, especially given the circumstances that we have to face. I'm not saying the IDF always chooses right or acts correctly, but given what we're up against and the enemy who is intent on sacrificing human beings, their civilians, in order to for their fighting purposes, we are fighting as ethically, actually more ethically than is actually possible. So I do want to say that. And finally, we have one comment. This comment refers to last week's podcast where I spoke about the leaders of American Jewish organizations, and I really posed the question: are they doing enough? And I talked about the father of one of the freed hostages how this father is himself a historian at Hebrew University. And he said that history is going to look back with embarrassment and shame, and how the Jews around the world did not support the hostages coming home, did not do enough to bring them home. And so Lou writes in, the US Jewish community, in my opinion, is either afraid or not sufficiently interested in supporting Israel during this difficult time. 5 years ago, they went all in on Black Lives Matter, national newspaper ads with lists of organizations, lawn signs, participating in marches, etc. Nothing like that on this scale has happened now, even after the huge rise in anti Semitism. I don't know what the solution is, but a major change in Jewish organizational leadership could be a good start. I've said this before. I don't think the American Jewish community has done enough. I'm not talking to you guys personally, because I think you are the outliers. You are the ones who are tuned in and who care. But so many Jews in North America have tuned out and do not care. And I think some leadership at some of these organizations would be good and healthy. At a lot of these major Jewish organizations, we have the same leaders that we had 20, 30 years ago. And they've come up through the system and earned their promotions, but they're, I think, out of touch with what it means to support Israel in this day and age, how to do it with nuance, how to get young people on board and making Israel feel relevant for them. So I do think that organizational leadership could be healthy. That wraps it up for today's broadcast. There is no live broadcast next Sunday because it is the first day of Passover, and we will all be taking the day off on that Chag. So our next live broadcast will be Sunday, April 20th at the usual 1 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time. So again, April 20th. This Wednesday, which is the 9th of April, you can download the most recent version of the audio podcast, Inside Israel, which is different from this one. That's on Apple and on Spotify. And again, at joelchasnoff.com, you can find the PDF, the Passover PDF that my team and I created to start conversation at your Passover table about Israel. And if you don't follow me on Instagram, check it out at Joel Chasnov. I have some comedic shorts about Israel, Israeli life, and the upcoming Passover holiday. For now, thank you for joining. Chag Sameach, everyone. Continue to write in with your questions. Have a wonderful Passover, and may all the hostages come home soon. Lehitraot from Israel.